Scripture says that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. That's what this video is about. I was a little concerned about making this video because it could come off as seeming like it's me bragging about something I accomplished. I'm very happy with what God accomplished through me. But without a long string of amazing events, how would it have happened? How could it have happened? How far back to go? I'll go back nearly 100 years, when the Great Depression caused my grandfather to move from rural Western Maryland, where the Grimms had lived for hundreds of years, to the crowded streets of Baltimore, Maryland, where my father grew up. And he became quite interested in ham radio, shortwave radio, amateur shortwave radio. And went to a very good high school, best engineering high school in the country. Got a good job in an engineering department as a draftsman, but wanted more. Went to college, good engineering college. Johns Hopkins was one of the top engineering schools at the time. And then World War II broke out. Perhaps he would have ended up spending the war years with the 29th Infantry, D-Day and all that, but another thing that had happened when he was young, he'd had scarlet fever and it had gone to his heart. So when he took his physical, when he volunteered, it was 4F. So he stayed in college. But he was in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, and that was a unique Reserve Officer Training Corps, being at an engineering college. Well, it wasn't all engineering, but they decided to take advantage of the engineering, and it was dedicated to training combat engineers, officers for combat engineers. And the result was that he still had his combat engineer's handbook on the shelf as I grew up. Well, I grew up loving animals, not in the cuddly sense, but in the sense of watching nature videos, nature movies, documentaries on TV in black and white. And the one that fascinated me most was the one about the Great Migration, the annual Great Migration of millions of hoofed animals, north and south in Africa, following the Rift Valley, from Sudan to Tanganyika, through Kenya. Now everybody had heard of Kenya, everybody had heard of Tanganyika, but what? Sudan? What's that? Where is that? Nobody had heard of Sudan. And interesting, those documentaries never showed the animals in Sudan. They'd show the map. They didn't show the animals in Sudan. Nobody went to Sudan to film animals. It's too far back on the backside of nowhere. But I was fascinated, and that's part of the story. So as I grew up, two things happened. I was fascinated with Africa and that great migration route, including Sudan, that great mystery. And I knew everything that was in the U.S. Army's manual, field manual for combat engineers. Grew up, had a job working for the Barnes Foundation, outdoor work, had a crew under me. One person in the crew was a young lady who had taken a safari all the way across Africa, west to east, through the Sahara and through Sudan. And then a year later had hitchhiked from Morocco to Zanzibar and gone through Sudan. And she kept telling me how much I would love Sudan. I went, I don't think so. She started praying that I would end up in Sudan. Oh well. So I go on with my career, become an engineer, and the vice president of engineering takes a leave of absence and goes with a missionary group for a year with his whole family to Juba in South Sudan. Comes back. Now we go all the way up to somewhere in the late 90s. And I'm in a friend's house, and these people who had been to Sudan are sitting around a table with me. I'm not going to mention names because of the nature of this video. And the host was someone who was a war hero, was nominated for the Medal of Honor, would have gotten it, except that the U.S. Army couldn't admit that the war had also taken place in Cambodia. So he couldn't get his award. Would have been embarrassing to admit that these events had happened. But he was quite a man, still is. And around that table, we discussed an oil pipeline. You see, the reason that the north of Sudan wanted to hang on to the south of Sudan was money. They had no money, but the south had oil, and oil is money. So they had built a pipeline, or actually two pipelines, with two big pumping stations to force the oil into the pipeline and collect it from all the oil wells and pump it to Port Sudan, where they could load it on ships and sell it. It was all the money that's the north, Khartoum as we call it, because that's the capital of Sudan now and was the capital then, where the northerners controlled the country from. The Khartoum government got all their money from that oil. We discussed it. We had been working on ways to help the SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, that for 20 years at that time had been trying to fight for freedom and to end the genocide in South Sudan. The enslavement of the children. Yes, slavery still goes on. People are bought and sold to this day. It's an Arab thing. But how to do it? And we sat there, and between us, we put together a plan. Largely, it was me asking the military guy if this would work, if this would work, if this would work, because I had the plan in mind, and it wasn't just a military plan. It was an engineering plan. You see, they had been having raids on those pipelines, and to no effect, because they would come upon an isolated stretch of pipeline. It's through the middle of nowhere, easy to get to, and they'd strap a bunch of explosives under it, and it would blow up in a huge ball of fire. Then the repair crews would come 3 hours later with their big trucks, and within 12 hours, they had that section taken out. They had a new section of pipe welded in, and the oil was flowing again. Spectacular, ineffective. What I knew was that there was some piece of equipment, I didn't know what it was, that would be hard to replace. It would not be in the pipeline, it would be in the pumping station. Some pieces of industrial equipment like that, you have to wait years to get a replacement. You have to order it, and then they say, yeah, we could start building that for you 3 years from now, and another year to build it. So 4 years from now, we can put it on a boat to send it to you. Things like that. I've been in industry long enough to know that, and that's also what I learned from the Field Engineers Manual, World War II, Army Corps of Engineers. So he put together a plan, and the most important part of the plan was not to try to get both pumping stations. Number of reasons, some of them military, some of them just practical. The particular troops that they were dealing with, that the SPLA had, there was no way they were going to coordinate two simultaneous, perfectly timed attacks. There was no way if you attacked one, if you tried, by the time you got to the other, they would have reinforced the guards by the hundreds. No way. But that wasn't the reason. The reason was political. You see, if you somehow blew up both pumping stations, permanently put them out of action, all it would do is make the government mad. But if you only blew up one, they would be constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. The military people would say, they're never going to get that other one. We've got it reinforced. And they would believe it. And it would be true. Bankers aren't military. The money people back in Khartoum, the soft, limousine-riding money people would say, oh no! They got through your defenses once. They might get through your defenses again. And then we'll have no oil and no money. What will we do? The military people say, no, it's not going to happen. They go, but what will we do? That was the plan. Well, how do you get the news to them? That plan was not something you could run up through the normal channels. We knew some of our channels were compromised. In another video, I've recorded how we made a documentary about the Lost Boys of South Sudan. It involved a trip to Nairobi and up to Kakuma, but for this purpose, Nairobi is what's important. One of the people sitting at that dining room table with the maps spread out that day was the person who organized that trip to Nairobi. Now here's where God worked things out for good. Her translator had relatives. And so they stayed in Nairobi in the house of his relatives. And one of his cousins was a man named Salva Kiir Mayardit. We say Salva, it's spelled Salva. He's currently the president of South Sudan. But he was just the commander-in-chief of the SPLA at the time, military commander. And he just happened to be on leave, coming back to visit his family. Cousin of the translator. Someone was staying with. And they sat and talked about many things, but one of them was the plan that we had formulated on a dining room table in America with the maps all spread out. There was one piece that was missing from the plan. We all knew it, and that was what is that, in a pumping station of that type, what is the most important, hardest to replace piece of equipment? We didn't know. But we knew that there were oil engineers among his people. A couple of years later, read in the newspaper that an oil pumping station in South Sudan had been destroyed by the SPLA. A few months later, we heard that the Khartoum government had agreed to a ceasefire and peace negotiations. Many months after that, we heard that at Lake Navassa, I always pronounce it wrong, I'm not going to try to correct myself, the negotiators, with the help, the mediation of the United States, who was represented by a man named Michael Renneberger, U.S. diplomat, had finally shaken hands on a comprehensive peace agreement, the CPA. 6 months later, South Sudan formed an autonomous regional government, and 5 years after that became an independent nation. Currently the youngest nation in the United Nations. It's interesting, I knew Michael. God works all things together for good. I would have always wondered whether it had anything to do with anything, what we had done. Till I met Michael on the phone. It's a long story why I met him, but he had retired from the U.S. government and was involved in a consulting firm. It was doing business with South Sudan, and I had contacted his boss, and the name was familiar, and then I remembered. I saw his resume. When I was in high school, my sister was in college, in a college that had recently gone from being all girls to being both boys and girls. 47-to-1 girl-to-boy ratio. But I had been there because of a snowstorm and school being closed and somebody being needed to make sure my sister didn't get stuck in a snowbank and one thing and another. I was bumming around for a whole day or 2 whole days at the student union of a college when I was a high school student. And ended up making friends with a boy there named Michael Renneberger. So then I got his cell phone number from his boss after he had a career in diplomacy, retired. I called him, among other things, I asked him, told him about that raid plan and said, did it have any effect? He said, yep. That's the raid that brought them to the peace table. Just like you said, they were scared that Selfa was going to blow up the other pumping station. There's a lot of links in that chain. Any one of those links, it would never have happened. Take out any one link, it would never have happened. And the war would still be going on today. And the genocide and the slavery. God makes all things work together for good, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose.